welcome to my page. My name is Rahanna and I will be starting a new segment on my channel where I'll be discussing true crime cases. I feel like a lot of these cases deserve more recognition and details into what exactly happened and what sort of laws or changes have occurred because of these cases. And that's something that I kind of want to discuss. The one case that really truly brought me back into true crime, and this case that I would like to discuss today is the Eastburn family murders. Military family Gary Eastburn and Catherine Eastburn were known to have love at first sight. They met in 1970 and later on went and got married in 1975 and had 3 children together. They had Kara, age 5, Erin, age 3, and Jana at 22 months old by the time it was 1983. Gary was a captain in the United States Air Force where he served at Pope Force Base as the Chief Air Traffic Control. Katie, by friends and family, was always described as a devoted mother and always, there for her children. And Gary, although he spent some time away working hard, he was always there for his children as well, and they really had a great family. Gary was being posted to England in the United Kingdom, and he and his family were gonna get ready for a move there. Gary had to undergo training at the squadron school in Montgomery, Alabama for 10 weeks. And although this was hard, him staying away from his family, he had to do what he had to do to get his training to move on to his next career. While Gary was away for the 10 weeks in Alabama, Katie and the children had stayed and decided to fix up some loose ends before the move. And one thing they had to do the most was Katie had placed an ad in the local newspaper for an adoption of their dog. The Eastburn family had an English settler named Dixie, who was 5 years old at the time, and they wanted to put him into a really good home before they left because they would find that it's easier than moving to England and having the dog move with them or putting the dog down. The weeks went by while Gary was in Alabama. They would keep in contact by frequently writing letters to each other and having scheduled phone calls every single Thursday where Gary would call from the garrison phone to Katie and hear from the kids. So 1 week away from his training being done, Gary called Katie and wasn't able to reach her actually. After a few unsuccessful attempts, he decided to continue on with, the night and see what would come of the next day. So when he tried again on Friday, he wasn't able to contact her once again. So he decided to reach out to a friend he had in North Carolina and asked his friend to, on behalf of them, call for a welfare check to the family home. The family was staying at 367 Summer Hills Road in North Carolina, and that is where the officer went to go perform a welfare check. At the time, it was 11 p.m. at night, and as the officer went to the front door and knocked around and tried to see if anybody was there, he had no response. So he went around to the back, tried again, no response once again. So what the officer decided to do was go and knock on the neighbor's door and see if they knew anything of it. The neighbors, Bob and Jeanette Seafell, were about asleep at this time. It's 11 p.m. and when the officer knocked on the door, they didn't really give too much to care about what was going on. I mean, they hadn't noticed their neighbors, but so what? Their neighbors hadn't noticed them, and it wasn't so abnormal to them, and they told the officer they didn't know what's going on. So they went on with their night. The officer went back on patrol, and the police officer had Bob wondering what was going on. So when he noticed that the car had not moved from the driveway, and he had noticed that the newspapers had never been picked up from the days before, he decided to, knock and ring the doorbell of the Eastburn family home. As Bob knocked and rang the doorbell of the Eastburn family home, he heard a faint crying noise a crying noise he knows to be true of that of a young child. And what Bob knew was that the Eastburn family had a young child, Jana, 22 months old at the time. What Bob did next was he called over his wife Jeanette to see, like, is he hearing this correctly? Like, is he really hearing a baby crying and nobody adhering to this baby? Once it was confirmed, they decided to call out the sheriff to see what is going on and how they can, help Jana. Once the police was notified, it took over 15 minutes for them to arrive to the household. At that time, Bob pointed out to the police officer that a latch has been opened in the house so they can go through that window, and the police officer did so. The police officer was stunned to find Jana, the 22-month-old baby, sitting in her crib in a salt of her own. Neighbors took Jana into their own house and tried to feed her, but every time Jana was trying to swallow down any sort of formula, she spat it right back up. They didn't know how long she'd been there, but she was extremely dirty and extremely dehydrated and malnourished. At that time, ambulances were called over and had brought Jana to the hospital, and it was said by the doctors that Jana was only a couple hours away from death herself, because within the family home laid Katie, Erin, and Kara, all dead. Police officers were startled by the findings of Katie, who was found on the side of her bed, who had her underwear ripped off, obvious signs of a rape, and also had been stabbed multiple times with slashes to her throat. They found Kara with multiple stabs to her chest and a slash to her throat as well. And then they found Erin underneath the covers of her own Star Wars blanket with multiple stab wounds and a cut to her throat as well. And it seemed as though in Erin's situation, she was trying to hide from the burglar because she was the only one found with the covers over her head. Learning that Katie, his wife, Kara, his 5-year-old daughter, and Erin, his 3-year-old daughter, were all murdered, Gary understandably broke down to the news of the murders of his family. Dr. Helen Bradley evaluated Jana, and every time Jana saw a picture of her mother, she would kiss the photo of her mother, and she would say, "Mommy's away right now, Mommy's away." The child psychologist also learned that Jana remembers a few sentences. Jana had remembered hearing "hide from the burglar," and also hearing that "he's gonna come and get us." They also believe that it's possible that the younger daughters, Erin and Kara, had told Jana to hide from the burglar. Or it's possible that the burglar didn't even know that Jana was in the house at the time of the murders. So that Jana could probably hear the murderer but could not identify them. Investigators started to investigate the neighborhood and see what they can find out about what occurred during the night of May 11th, because that was the night that Gary wasn't able to get in contact with Katie. They found a lady who had said that she had seen a white Chevy Chevette near the Eastburn families on the night in suspicion of the murder. When interviewed the babysitter of the Eastburn family's children, she alluded to the fact that Katie had received some phone calls in the coming days leading up to the events of the murder in a sexual nature, and then some of just pure silentness. And this was a time before, obviously, like caller ID and ways of figuring out who called you. Patrick Cohen, a 20-year-old who lived in the area visiting his girlfriend at the time, left around 3:30 and had seen a man leaving around the Eastburns family's home with a trash bag over his shoulder. This man was described to be tall, wearing a members only jacket that was in the shade of a green color, and had said to him, "Getting an early start today," and had left in a white Chevy Chevette. With this in mind, police decided to sit Patrick down and get a sketch of who he had seen on that night. One thing that was found was in Katie's letter to Gary, which I guess at the time Gary never received, or it was kind of just like flew over his shoulders when everything went down. But one thing that they had noticed after looking through the letters is that the English settler dog had been adopted by a nice man who came by and took the dog only a few days before the events that had occurred. So with that in mind, the police decided to do a call out to the public to see who, if anybody knows, adopted the dog, because they may have been the last person to see Katie Eastburn and her children alive. Angela Hennis was one of those people watching the news that night and had noticed that her husband, Tim Hennis, was actually the person who they're looking to speak to in regards of the adoption of the dog. That very dog is the dog that Tim had gotten from Katie. So let me give you a little background on Tim. Tim at the time was an army sergeant, where he currently had been married to his wife Angela and had a 2-month-old baby at the time. He was having marital problems and financial issues keeping up with the bills. It was a big financial stress on him and his family at the time. When Tim entered the police station just to speak to them, because he had been asked to come forward if you were the person who had adopted the dog, just for, sakes of, when last have you seen Katie? When last were you over to that house to get the dog? But investigators, as soon as they saw Tim's face, their jaws dropped. Tim was a dead ringer match, looking like the person that Patrick had described leaving the Eastburn family's house. He had a striking resemblance to the sketch drawn up from Patrick's encounter with the man who was leaving the Eastburn family's house. So right away, investigators sat Tim down and started questioning him. It seemed like an interrogation, really and truly, because why was he the person seen leaving the house, or at least looks like the person leaving the house, and he was the person who adopted the dog? It seems like he has a fairly good connection to the family already, so he might be the person that investigators are very interested in speaking to. After a very long interrogation, Tim had decided to give DNA and said, "Test the DNA. This will clear my name. Test the DNA. There is nothing in the house that would belong to Tim at all." After the long interrogation, Tim was allowed to leave. And as he was seen leaving with his 2-month-old baby and his wife, the investigators walked him up to a little, if you can guess already, white Chevy Chevette. And they drove away. And suspicions, I don't know about you guys, but if suspicions were not alarming right now, alert, that is a little bit sus. Dry cleaner had came forward stating that Tim had actually dropped in a members only green jacket to the dry cleaners, and there was some sort of red substance on the coat itself, and the dry cleaner was able to get it out, of course, but had noted that that was, something to add to the story. What was this red substance found on his jacket? Was this of blood? Was he really trying to cover his own tracks? A woman named Alfredi Budget had seen Tim taking a trash can from the front of his yard and taking it to the side of his house and burning something in it. It was an unusual sight because there was a lot of flames, and that's just not something that commonly happens within their neighborhood. So she found that to be really weird and a little bit suspect, because that was during the day after they suspected that the Eastburn family was murdered. So Patrick Cohn, the 20-year-old who lived in the neighborhood, who saw the witness that matched, Tim Hennis's description, was brought back in, and with a lineup of photos had actually identified Tim as the person who he had seen on that very night. Detectives started to build their case against him. They said they have Jana, the only witness, the only survivor of this whole thing, who noted that it was definitely a male burglar, a male murderer in that house. They also had Patrick, who stated that a person who looked an awful like Tim and definitely identified Tim with the photo lineup had seen him leaving the house in a white Chevy Chevette. You have also the neighbor who saw the white Chevy Chevette in the neighborhood, which obviously was not like a common car to see in the neighborhood too. And then you also have the dry cleaner with the red stain on the members only jacket. And then you also have the fact that Tim was the person who had adopted the family's dog, and you're just seeing the connection as how he, you know, first learned about the Eastburns in a sense. With all that, the investigators decided to arrest him on the charges of all 3 murders and 1 sexual assault on all probable causes and bring him to court. The detectives are still trying to build their case against Tim, so they decided to see what else was missing, what else was gone from the Eastburn family's home. And what they had noticed was a few cash laying around the house had been gone, as well as Katie Eastburn's debit card. So they tracked her debit card transactions, and after a time that Katie was definitely presumed dead, they had seen transactions occur on her ATM card. Investigators learned that before the bodies were discovered, there had been a few transactions on Katie Eastburn's ATM card. 2 times, $150 had been withdrawn from Katie Eastburn's debit card. They went to the financial institution and decided to see who had, you know, taken this cash out. Did you have any cameras? Did you have any sort of way of identifying who had done it? And the best that they had to offer was identifying who did the transaction after this had occurred on the debit card. And with that, there came a woman positively identified Tim Hennis as the person who used the card at the ATM. This added to the theory that Tim was having financial problems. See, because he was 2 months behind in rent and owed his landlord $300 for rent. And what was found out after was Tim paid $300 plus an extra $50 for the penalty of paying late to his landlord right on time, actually a couple days just after the murders of the Eastburn families had occurred. Detectives have learned that Tim had went to go see his ex-girlfriend the night of question. When she had rejected his sexual advances, he had left. And what detectives believed what happened next was that Tim had decided to go back to the house of the Eastburn family where he had picked up the dog and try this with now Katie. Katie, now a devoted mother and wife, took obviously a disliking to whatever Tim had to offer, and he became enraged. And from what was him seeking out sex for the night, turned into him murdering 3 people. Sometimes I can't understand that sort of thing though. If it's and this is just my opinion, if you wanted to have sex, you don't have money, I don't know, I find that it could be cheaper to drive out to your wife. It could be cheaper to, do something to yourself. The fact that he went so much extreme to have whatever he wanted to have in that very moment at the cost of other people's lives just so you wouldn't be identified, it's really, really, really messed up. And something to note also at the time is Tim, he had no criminal record. I mean, he's in the army, he's a sergeant, he is, to any other person, a regular law-abiding citizen. And the fact that from going for sexual advances to murdering is a pretty big jump just for one night. And it's something to really question in this case. Like, why would somebody go to such extremes to have sex one night? That just doesn't make sense in my mind, at least. So 1 year after the murders had occurred in 1986, the trial had begun. The case of Tim's defense. His lawyers argued that all of the evidence that they had found at the crime scene does not a match for Tim. They argued that there was semen found in Katie, which was not a match for Tim, being that it was 1986 and they could not test DNA at the time. They decided to just say that it's not a match for Tim because you cannot match it with certainty that it is for him. There was hair found at this crime scene, which was pubic hair, and they're saying that by looking at the hair typing, which is what they also had in the 1980s, it was not a match for Tim as well. There was a footprint found in the Eastburn family's home, and they were saying that it was not a match for Tim as well in the size that the shoe print was. The lawyers on their side were pretty confident that since the physical things could not physically match Tim as a person, the intruder, the murderer of the household, he could be very much just set free for this awful crime that had been committed. So at the time they had blood type matching, and there was an overwhelming amount of blood from the Eastburn had masked the blood of the intruder, so it would not be able to tell who was in the house by the blood type. Semen was also found, but at the time they couldn't identify who it belonged to. Rahanna's trial lasted a total of 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for a total of 10 hours, and after their deliberation they came back with a verdict saying that Tim Hennis was guilty of all charges, 3 murders and 1 sexual assault, and sentenced him to death. This was absolutely great news for the Eastburn family. I mean, it wouldn't bring back, you know, Katie and Kara and Erin, of course, but it was relief to know that the person who had done it had been caught and does not get to live a life of luxury. Yet, of course, Gary had to, you know, move on too. I mean, he was set to go to the UK, continue his Air Force career, and he had Jana now, the one thing that he could put most purpose into life. Shortly after Tim was in prison, he received a letter. The lawyers for Tim decided to appeal the conviction, and the state Supreme Court actually got involved, stating that, you know, it wasn't a fair trial. The fact that there was over 4 hours of pictures and videos of the crime scene, anybody sitting in Tim's chair would probably want it to be convicted too. The jury would want to convict anybody who's sitting in that chair. 4 hours of the gruesome scenes, the photos, it's a lot to take in. And they think that by them showing it for that long period of time, it had prejudiced the jury into believing that anybody who was sitting in that chair was guilty and should deserve the death penalty. The Supreme Court awarded Tim with a new trial, and the defense and the prosecution started to work on ways that they can get into this next trial, both wanting to win, of course. In 1989, being that now Tim has only served 2 years in prison at the time, a new trial had begun. The defense's new strategy is a witness. A mailman who had been in the Eastburn family neighborhood sighted a man of a shorter structure with long stringy hair leaving the Eastburn family's home, and they believe that he possibly could be a suspect within the case. The defense also went in onto the fact of the Mr. X note, and someone obviously stating that, you know, Tim is doing the crime for the case that he is not guilty of. The one big move that the defense decided to play was putting Tim on the stand himself. They had Tim on the stand confessing to not being the person who had committed these murders. He declared his innocence and the fact that he could never do something like that. He only saw her when he got the dog and adopted the dog, and that was the only instance he was ever in, around, or at the Eastburn family home. The defense also questioned Patrick. Ever since the first trial, which happened in 1986, 3 years had passed and Patrick had been in a little bit of crimes, you know? They are questioning Patrick Cohn's credibility. Like, how well does this guy who, you know, doesn't really care how much he's perceived with in public could be lying about what had occurred on that night. The defense also questioned the woman who was claiming to see Tim use Katie's card at the ATM. Like in reality, like 3 minutes and 30 seconds, it's enough time for someone to like drive to an ATM, get out of their car, and perform a transaction. Once that transaction pings, somebody else is driving, parks their car, and goes to the ATM. I can see how they could not cross. And in the defense's, defense, of course, they were trying to say that a lot of things can happen within 3 minutes and 30 seconds. And at the time, the police already had Tim Hennis's face all over the news. Maybe the woman just, went with the crowd. That's what the defense was kind of like hoping on, that like the jury would understand that it's just probable cause to just say that, oh yeah, he did it, yeah, I saw him, that sort of thing. That's what they were going for. So as you can see, they're poking holes in the case. And the prosecution, they were not like ready for that. They were gonna go in with the exact same strategy as before, but for everything that they had to come back for it. And they also had new evidence to say that it could possibly be somebody else. Shorter structure, longer hair. Why are you only looking at Tim? With all that being said, the jury deliberated, and when they came back, they found Tim not guilty of the Eastburn family murders. And they had acquitted him of all charges that were laid on him before. Tim Hennis was able to walk out that very day as a free man. There's like this moment captured on camera and everyone's surrounding Tim, so happy for him. And he's holding his daughter. His daughter's now like 4 at the time. And like they're crying, happy, tears. It's like a nice reunion. But for the Eastburns, if you think about them, this is like crazy. Like Gary knew in his gut that like everything had laid towards Tim being the person. He had adopted the dog. He had known that Gary Eastburn, the man of the house, was not around. There was phone calls like to Katie, and then it all led up to this escalation of his whole family, with the exception of Jana, murdered. So he just knew that something was like up with Tim, and the fact that he was exonerated of all his charges, it really stuck with Gary. But Gary went on, like he was meant to go to England the year of the murders, and what he did was he actually delayed that, but he went to England. He went a little bit north of London and actually had met an English nurse there. And in 1991, married Liz, an English nurse. At the time, Jana was 8 years old, and that was the mother that Jana only knew. I mean, she was only so young when her mother, Katie, had tragically been murdered. So now Jana clung to the fact that she had her father and she had her new stepmom, and she was very happy, and they tried to do everything they could to give Jana everything she wanted in life. Later on, the family settled in Washington, near Seattle actually, in 1998. Tim, his wife, and his daughter were paid to appear on a television show called Current Affair, where he blared his innocence for the case of the Eastburn family and said that, you know, he was feeling great, feeling like justice was finally served, that, you know, it's a tragedy what had occurred, but it was not him who had done the crime. Tim was serving in multiple tours and was a decorative soldier. After 30 years within the army, he became a master sergeant and had retired and had a very successful loving career. Him and his wife Angela, they never separated, and they went on to having another son together. A book called The Innocent Victims was created covering the Eastburn family's murders, and it also kind of honed in and focused on how the investigators only focused on Tim. Later it came to light that there was a boy. He had a members only jacket, green color, was tall, was blonde, could be a dead ringer for Tim. But once investigators had found him, the investigators took away his jacket and only gave it back to the man after Tim had been found guilty of the murders. Innocent Victims, from a book, turned into a movie actually, and it was pretty popular. It had good ratings. So with that, 20 years had passed, you know, it was now 2003, and the Eastburn family murders was now a cold case. Detective Larry Trowther decided to open up the case once again and see what he can do about it now with so much advancements in DNA and technology that had occurred over the 20 years. When Captain Larry Trowther had opened up the case and saw the one thing that could really give answers to what happened to the Eastburn family's case, he got it tested. That one thing was a vaginal swab from Katie Eastburn. Gary answered. The detective said if he is sitting down, and that he should be sitting down. And once he had sat down, the detectives told him the truth. All along, what Gary had thought and the detectives had thought, the DNA taken from the vaginal swab of Katie Eastburn was a match to Tim Hennis, 1 in 12,000 trillion %. Although now the detectives and Gary and everybody who was involved with the case from the beginning had one big problem. The fact that double jeopardy exists in the United States, and the fact that they cannot try Tim again for a case that he was found to be not guilty from a set of his own peers, the jury. The Constitution prohibits double jeopardy from happening again. The state couldn't touch Hennis. Like, what could they do at this point? They couldn't bring him back into court or anything. Like, they had nothing that they could do. But then they thought of how Tim's last few years of life has been. Pretty great, right? He served in tours because he was in the army. And that's one thing that they could account on. They talked to the officials. They could call Tim back into service, and as soon as they called Tim back into service, he was told that he will be going on a trial for the murders of the Eastburns family and the sexual assault. So the court-martial decided to start the trial, and the defense immediately took to the fact, stating that yes, sure, semen was found in Katie Eastburn. That was sure a match for Tim Hennis, but that doesn't mean that Tim Hennis, you know, murdered the family. That means that Tim and Katie had consensual sex in the defense's eyes. They were alluding to the fact that, you know, military wives, while their husband's away at duty, they would have consensual affairs. And they're saying all of this in a room full of military husbands. They're like, what are you saying about, like, our wives? Our wives are devoted, committed, like, they're not, like, that. So that didn't play over very well at all for the defense. Though, if you remember, right, when Tim went up during his second trial, he had said that he only had seen Katie and the Eastburns ever been to that house, the whole shebang. The only time he's ever done anything was when he adopted the dog. So when he was asked before if he had ever had sex with Katie Eastburn, he had said no. So now the fact that it's 2003 and he's changing his story, right? Like, that's kind of weird, and that is totally suspect or sus, like, because why are you changing your story all of a sudden? April 8, 2010, the court found Tim Hennis to be guilty of all 4 counts, 3 murders of Katie, Kara, and Erin, and also the sexual assault that had occurred on Katie. They also found Tim to have 4 consecutive life terms of imprisonment for the death penalty in this case. Going back to the trial, like, Jana, she stood trial at the 3rd trial, stating how, you know, great her father was and how, you know, great she's heard stories of her mother, but she would have never now be able to experience the love of her mother, the love of her siblings, because, you know, Tim had taken that away from her at such a young age and left her with a distraught childhood. The fact that she had to experience so much as a young baby. So Gary Eastburn doesn't think that Tim will be executed for his death because the last military execution happened in 1961. It has to have like presidential approval. So most likely it's probably that Tim will live out his dying days in jail. But of course, it's really hard to tell. Like, Gary is quoted to be saying, like, I wouldn't jump up and down and say that he should be. I'm perfectly happy if he spends the rest of his life in jail. However, if they did execute him, it would be no more than he deserved. That is the story of the Eastburn family murders. It is a crazy story, in my opinion, because it really like questions a lot of things as you're going through the evidence, as you're going through it, because he's gone from dead ringer of being guilty on circumstantial evidence to, you know, not guilty based on poking holes in those circumstantial evidence to being guilty once again with the hard facts of DNA. A lot of things have occurred. If you ever like heard of the Innocence Project, like a lot of things have occurred over time where they're trying to eliminate, you know, people who are innocent going to jail for crimes that they didn't commit. And when cases like this happen, Eastburns in this case scenario, they had to live now learning that after all of this craziness, that Tim Hennis and his family lived 30 minutes away from the Eastburns in the same state after all the tragedy that they've gone through in the last 30 years. So it's really, really crazy when you think about that, because like they've been through so much. They're both military, but the fact is, like, they come back to the same place once again, facing the fact that like the Eastburns' wife Katie and Kara and Erin are now all gone because of the events that occurred on that night, and one man was able to live his life to the fullest. Tim Hennis is currently on death row in an army facility in Fort Leavenworth in Kansas as he awaits to see how he'll live out his dying days. But they've tried multiple times to appeal because they find that the fact that double jeopardy is a law within America's state courts, but it's an exception to the military court, and the court system would not have it. The fact is, military court in the United States is completely different from the state court. So the fact is, Tim Hennis is fully guilty for the charges that had occurred and the crimes that had occurred. Do you think that like double jeopardy should be a thing when it comes to cases that had occurred before advancements in technology to test DNA and test fingerprints, test all of these things that can definitely incriminate somebody of a crime and also make somebody innocent of a crime, even if double jeopardy had occurred. If somebody didn't do the crime and DNA and further advancements in technology can prove that they didn't do the crime, why should they serve in a prison for it, even if they've been through two trials and have been found guilty of it? Like, it just, like, I don't know. Let me know your thoughts down below, and if you have any case suggestions, I'm open to hearing them, so just comment them as well. And thank you for coming and checking out my first true crime video, and I hope you liked it. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you next time. Bye.